Brent Enders here again with Mike Walters at America's Financial Headquarters. Mike, as we walk our way through these 12 retirement risks, we left off with lifestyle risk there. And some of the things that we've learned over the years is there's certain segments of the population that unfortunately do experience some pretty significant lifestyle risk, but it can happen to everybody. And the two that tend to be most common are entertainers and athletes. They just have a tendency to
a lot of magazines that way.
They live beyond their means, and their lifestyle risk comes into play when it relates to their finances, and it's unfortunate. But, you know, it can happen to everybody. You had mentioned there at the last section that we were discussing people who have certain lifestyles. They have swimming pools, they may drive certain cars, they may live certain distances from work, and the cost of energy and things of that sort, you know, it all has a play on their retirement assets and how long they last. Now, those things, interestingly, though, Mike, on lifestyle risks, the individual has a lot more control over those kind of risks.
Right.
You know, they get to choose what kind of car they drive, what kind of home they live in, whether they want a pool or not. But the next risk that we want to talk about, which is medical expense risk, you know, people don't have choices as to when and how that happens. But before we get into that, Mike, one thing we did want to remind folks of is the Medicare open enrollment period is creeping up, and the deadline for that is December the 7th.
Yes, good catch. Glad you remembered that.
Yeah, so if you've not taken care of that this year and that applies to you, please be sure to take care of that. We're running out of time.
Yes, you definitely need to take care of those things. Well, in terms of your medical expense or your health risks, as you mentioned, I mean, there are some choices you can argue in terms of, you know, are you doing crazy dangerous stuff?
Sure.
Are you a smoker? Are you eating too much? Are you not staying healthy? That kind of thing. But generally speaking, the biggest costs that really affect your financial planning, they tend to come usually at later years, but not always, but usually at later years. And when a couple enters retirement, it's essentially a coin toss that at least one of them, it's 50-50 chance that at least one of them is going to need some sort of home health care, assisted living, adult daycare, or actual nursing home care. And so to turn a blind eye to that is really foolish when you're doing your planning, because if you haven't prepared in advance for it, then the only solution at that point is to invade your portfolios and withdraw that money and pay those bills. And so it probably, arguably, is the #1 threat to your financial plan once you hit a certain age, let's say 60 and above or whatever the case might be. So you do need to take it very serious. And as we were mentioning before, you can't play off of the normal CPI, the normal inflation rates. Because if you look at that CPI that we were talking about previously, the Consumer Price Index, they only account for medical care as 7% of the overall. So what they're really saying to you is they think the average person is only spending 7% of their money on medical care issues. Well, if you end up needing nursing home or adult assistance of any sort, you're going to be way beyond that 7%, and yet medical care costs itself has been increasing at double the inflation rate.
That's a good point, Mike. I mean, when they're measuring the CPI index, they're taking the average of the consumers in our country. And so you've got 20-year-olds and 30-year-olds mixed in there along with 70, 80, 90-year-olds, as you point out, which are the ones that typically experience the higher cost of medical expenses given the point of life where they're in. So it's a little bit misleading. And you add to the fact that there's so many different options for consumers today, which is great in terms of if they run into a medical issue, how do they want to be taken care of? Used to be it was hospital, nursing home. Now there's so many other options, like you mentioned, adult daycare and home health care. I mean, those are actually the more popular choices, because the last thing most people want to do is to go into a facility, into a nursing home. But yet, unfortunately, those are oftentimes two of the more expensive options in addition. So some of that, again, is lifestyle, because they're going to try to choose which type of facility they would want to go to if they needed help. But if the event takes place that's out of their control, they're forced to make some pretty difficult and some pretty expensive decisions.
Yeah, and oftentimes you end up staging your way into it.
True.
So if you're starting to struggle, if you're starting to have certain incapacities, you're probably not going to go from, you know, being happy and healthy in your home to next week you're in a nursing home. There's an erosion, if you will, that generally occurs. So if you kind of work your way up that scale, the normal starting point is probably home health care, where someone is coming to your home to help assist and take care of things.
And oftentimes on a limited basis, maybe once a day for a period of time, but then sometimes it grows into around-the-clock care at home, which gets quite expensive.
Right.
But even within that, there's staging.
And that's why there's often kind of an hourly rate approach to that. And so as we get into this, we're talking here about the medical expenses and how that can attack and invade your portfolio, especially during retirement. One of the things we would always recommend when you're looking at that is take into serious consideration that inflation that we've been discussing, but also take into consideration the protection. Whether you're purchasing long-term care insurance or asset-based long-term care insurance, which we've discussed on previous shows, those are all things that are out there to help you create a layer of insulation between these expenses and your retirement plan and your investment portfolios. But the costs themselves, Brent, as we were starting to talk about that, they tend to kind of creep in. They tend to work their way in. You don't generally just jump right into that nursing home. And so as you pointed out, some of the home health care things, the national median average, they tell us from an hourly rate, is about $19 to $20 an hour to have these people come in and take care of you. If you end up going to kind of a full home health care approach, as you also mentioned, so where they're really there a fair amount of time, the national average for that, the median, I should say, annual cost, it's not an average, it's a median. The median is just under $44,000 per year.
Wow.
So suddenly, that's a big chunk of dollars that you have to take care of, and like we talked about before, from an inflation perspective, it blows everything out of whack. So the national average is coming in at just under $44,000. If you're living primarily in the Midwest, that's probably a pretty good number for you. If you're over to the East Coast, it's going to be inflated more, I would say, looking at this map that I have in front of me, probably more in the $50,000 range, and the West Coast is probably creeping up in about the $50,000 range as well.
Well, Brent Enders and Mike Walters here at America's Financial Headquarters. Mike, one of the things we'd like to do, we've done in the past, is to offer up our cost of care survey as we discuss these medical expenses and the high costs and the risk associated with retirement planning. Again, you're listening, you can dial into the 24/7 hotline at 888-888-9572 or visit us online at financialhq.com and request your copy of the cost of care survey to see exactly what you might be dealing with in terms of these high expenses.
And Brent, that is a great tool. I would encourage all of you to go there and take advantage of that. If you want to get the whole piece, it literally breaks down by the state. So depending on where you live, it'll tell you exactly what some of these costs are, as opposed to some of the national averages that we're referring to right now.
And if you've not experienced it firsthand with a friend or family member, a lot of folks, it's going to be kind of eye-popping, Mike, to see some of these costs. And they can dramatically swing by different city and state as well.
Yeah, you know, a newer phenomenon in this category is adult daycare.
Sure.
Where just like kids get dropped off at daycare, elderly or those who need assistance from a health standpoint can get dropped off at essentially an adult daycare. That's running on average across the United States just under $16,000 per year.
You know, it's interesting you mentioned that, Mike. Just over the Thanksgiving holiday, we were traveling to see family, and my kids, for the first time, we were driving on a major intersection and saw an adult daycare facility, and it said so outside. And at first they thought it was comical because they thought it was some kind of a spoof or a joke, and I explained that no, that just like there's kid daycare, there's adult daycare, because it's becoming so common now for older adults to move back in with their children. Well, if both of their children are, say, 50, 60 and still working, trying to help mom and dad, they move back in the home, they need to find something to do during the day to assist them. And if they don't choose to have someone come to the home for home health care to do it, they got to find a place to take them during the day where they're working. So it is definitely a viable option, becoming more and more popular.
It is becoming very popular. And next in the line, if you will, line of attack, would be assisted living. And assisted living for a one-bedroom single occupancy, so basically you have an apartment that you're in, but there are services and people nearby that help take care of things. The national average for that is just under $40,000 per year. And then if we bump it up to a full-blown private room nursing home, where it is a true nursing home and you have your own room, the national average is over $81,000 per year. So if someone is in a nursing home facility for 2, 3, 5 years, that's a significant impact that they have to account for within their financial plan.